from the beginning, when the occupation began, of course, settlements started pretty soon after the war ended. Israel realized that a lot of the world didn't like what they were doing. They were opposed to the colonization. They wanted Israel to give back that land. And to try to deal with that, they increasingly realized that many, many nations around the world, in fact, although they may publicly have said they opposed what was going on in Palestine, actually they were very keen to get advice, weapons, and training from the Israelis. In other words, using Palestine as a testing ground, battle tested, as we say now. So pretty much from the beginning, but it really accelerated after the 1960s, and that's continued now for close to 55, 60 years, where I estimate, we don't even know the exact number, but something like 140 countries on the planet have bought some form of Israeli surveillance tech, weapons, or hardware in the last decade. It's just a remarkable number.
Ciao a tutte e tutti, ben ritrovati al Wernex Fest, grazie per essere qui in uno dei diversi appuntamenti del festival che trattano di quello che sta succedendo nel conflitto tra Israele e Hamas nella striscia di Gaza. Questo è un talk che presenterà questo libro che si intitola Laboratorio Palestina ed è molto interessante analizzarlo qui oggi con l'autore perché ci consente di contestualizzare quello che sta avvenendo da qualche mese in un percorso storico più lungo. Giusto per darvi qualche cifra, un ultimo rapporto delle Nazioni Unite ha parlato della risposta israeliana nella striscia di Gaza come una punizione collettiva nei confronti della popolazione palestinese. Parliamo di un conflitto che ha già causato 37.000 morti civili tra civili e combattenti di Hamas, cui si aggiungono ovviamente ai 1.200 morti degli attacchi di ottobre che hanno scatenato questa erizione senza precedenti da parte di Israele. Ovviamente sono eventi storici da vedere in una scia di oppressione, occupazione e apartheid che continua dal 1948. Laboratorio Palestina di Antony Loewenstein è un libro che racconta un pezzo di questa storia, in particolare i rapporti tra tecnologie militari e tecnologie di sorveglianza e come Israele sia diventato nel lungo periodo uno delle più forti potenti militari industriali del settore, testando spesso la propria tecnologia sulla popolazione palestinese, da qui Laboratorio Palestina, per poi esportarla in tutto il mondo, e vedremo è una storia che si intreccia anche con l'apartheid in Sudafrica, con il Cile di Pinochet, con la Romania di Ceausescu, con i regimi in Indonesia e altri regimi assolutamente non democratici. L'autore di Laboratorio Palestina è Antony Loewenstein, un giornalista investigativo australiano, sarà connesso con noi appunto dall'Australia, ha vissuto a lungo tra il 2016 e il 2020 a Gerusalemme Est ed è una firma del New York Times, del Guardian, del Washington Post, di Al Jazeera, della New York Review of Books, tra tante altre testate. Anthony, many thanks for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you with us in Milan today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. Hi, everybody.
Thank you, Anthony. Now I also see you here, so it feels like having you here.
Okay.
So something that it's really, really interesting about your book, it is a book about the history of Israel, but it's also so urgent in light of what is going on in Gaza since a few months now. And it's a story of how Israel became so strong and so powerful and so important in the technology military business. And this development is a story that is very much connected with authoritarian regimes across history. And this story is mostly untold. So I would like to ask you as a first question, how Israel became so important when it comes to military and surveillance technologies?
Pretty much from near the beginning. Israel was obviously born in 1948, and really from the beginning, its early leaders realized that it needed to make friends. Now, obviously, new nations have to make friends. That's not particularly unusual. But what was quite unique was pretty much from the 1950s, Israel was already selling weapons. Back then, it was pretty basic guns, things like that, to some clients, mostly the Germans. Fast forward to the 60s, and obviously 1967, Israel won the Six-Day War. took over the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. And from the beginning, when the occupation began, of course, settlements started pretty soon after the war ended. Israel realized that a lot of the world didn't like what they were doing. They were opposed to the colonization. They wanted Israel to give back that land. And to try to deal with that, they increasingly realized that many, many nations around the world, in fact, although they may publicly have said they opposed what was going on in Palestine, actually they were very keen to get advice, weapons, and training from the Israelis. In other words, using Palestine as a testing ground, battle tested, as we say now. So pretty much from the beginning, but it really accelerated after the 1960s, and that's continued now for close to 55, 60 years, where I estimate, we don't even know the exact number, but something like 140 countries on the planet have bought some form of Israeli surveillance tech, weapons, or hardware in the last decade. It's just a remarkable number.
And of course, when we talk about the situation of Palestinian territory and the Gaza Strip, is a history of apartheid, which also has like a digital counterpart, which is the oppression is also being imposed on the Palestinian people through digital surveillance technologies. And we're all familiar with the pictures of walls and checkpoints in Palestine, but there is also this digital side, which is mostly conducted through facial recognition technologies, drones, and stuff like Blue Wolf, the facial recognition system that is patrolling and constantly monitoring movements of the Palestinian people. So I would like to ask you if you could describe for us how is daily life in those territories under this constant digital surveillance?
The best way to put this is that for every Palestinian living in Palestine, this includes Gaza, and of course I'm talking both before October 7, but certainly since, in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, we're talking about 5 million people, roughly. And every aspect of their life is controlled. And what I mean by that is that all their communication, emails, phone calls, text messages, is monitored. Doesn't mean every single phone call was listened to, but it's monitored in some way. It's stored. It's assessed by Israeli intelligence officials. And under the guise, of course, of fighting terrorism and security, but actually it's not really about that. It's about total control to make Palestinians realize that they're not free, that in fact their master ultimately is Israel. And as you say, this has been going on for decades, but it's accelerated in the 21st century, where the digital era has allowed biometric tools, facial recognition technology, drones, increasingly AI-enabled warfare is something we're seeing in Gaza, which I know we'll talk about in a minute. And the impact of that really is that in particular places of Palestine, particularly cities like Hebron, which is the ultimate expression of apartheid, we have literally about 1,000 fundamentalist Jewish settlers living in a Palestinian city with tens and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, in fact, of Palestinians. And life is made pretty good for the Israeli Jews, settlers, but horrific for Palestinians. And Israeli soldiers spend their days with certain kind of mobile phone type devices in their hands, trying to gather information about every single Palestinian, man, woman, and child. Of course, the Palestinians have no consent. They have no idea what that information is being used for, but to some extent they have a bit of an idea, because what it means in practice is it can impact where you can go. It can impact if you can go to point A to point B. You might get to a checkpoint. And for reasons that you don't really ever know, you're never told, there's no way to get legal clarity around this because it's a military occupation. You can't go to the next village. You can't go to Jerusalem. You can't go to your workplace to visit your family in the next town. This is what this technology is doing. And increasingly what we're seeing is it's not just staying in Palestine, it's being exported globally, which is why I thought the book was so important, right? That what happens in Palestine never stays there.
And while I was reading the book, one of the most kind of impressive things that you discuss in the book is the use of drones. And here we in Italy, we are very much familiar with the patrolling of the borders in the Mediterranean Sea, also through drones, which are airplanes without humans controlling it that are used to patrolling the sea. And also this technology is being developed by Israel and tested on the Palestinian people. So since this is something we are probably more familiar with here in Italy, can you tell us more about the role of drones in this picture?
Yeah, so Israel has been using and pioneering drones for decades. In fact, they've been using them for close to 40, 50 years, but certainly it's accelerated this century. And a lot of the drones that are now around the world, including used by the European Union, were tested first over Gaza. And this began in around 2007, 2008, when obviously the blockade was imposed on Gaza by Israel and Egypt, when Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip. And in the 6 wars that Gaza has experienced since, the most recent one being the most deadly, of course, since October 7, Israeli drones are flying 24/7. I've spent a lot of time in Gaza in the last 15 years, and you always hear the sound of drones, always hear them. It's remarkable when you speak to Gazan people and friends of mine who live there and the ones who have escaped in the last 8 months, and they say that even kids learn what the sounds of weapons are, including drones. And one of the most disturbing aspects I found when researching this book was how Israeli drones are used, as you say, by the European Union to try to impose what I call Fortress Europe, an attempt, and of course Italy, as you people there well know, is a key part of this architecture to try to keep, frankly, brown and black bodies out of Europe. And these drones that the European Union are using are not armed, but they are circling the Mediterranean 24/7, and they're providing the pictures, the images, which are going back to the headquarters of Frontex, the border security arm of the EU, in Warsaw, Poland. And then the EU is making a decision whether they rescue people or not. And we all know that the vast majority of people are not rescued, which is a deliberate policy. People are being allowed to drown. Of course, if you're Ukrainian and white, you'll be allowed into Europe. And I undoubtedly support Ukrainians being protected, don't get me wrong. But if you're African or Middle Eastern or Muslim, that's of course a whole different story. So the Israeli architecture is central to what the EU is using, and the EU only uses and buys those drones because they have been battle tested in Gaza in the last 15 years.
And you mentioned before artificial intelligence, which is increasingly playing a part in contemporary warfare. And in April, to Israeli opposition news outlets, Plus 972 magazine and Local Call, published an investigation about Vendere, which is an AI system that the IDF uses to, and I quote, isolating and identifying thousands of Palestinians as potential bombing targets in Gaza. So it's an artificial intelligence system that is used to track and select potential bombing targets in the Gaza Strip. And Al Jazeera has defined this system as an AI-assisted genocide. So I would like to ask you, Antony, what's precisely the role of AI in the war in Gaza at the moment, and how much is Israel advanced in these regards compared to other countries?
So Israel's been using AI in warfare for quite a few years, but as has the US and other states. But there's no doubt that since October 7 and Israel's genocide in Gaza for the last 8+ months, Israel has hugely accelerated. Now, what does that practically mean? It's important to note that we don't know all the details yet.
Yeah.
They are obviously secret. But what we do know, both from that reporting you cite, great reporting by an Israeli journalist, Yuval Abraham, and also sources I've spoken to, say that after October 7, the Israeli mood was obviously anger, fear, and really revenge. And there were so many targets that Israel wanted to hit in Gaza, which weren't necessarily even connected to Hamas, because the aim was mass destruction. That was the point. It was not to go after just Hamas at all. And we know that because 8+ months after the war, 70% of Gaza has been destroyed. Yeah. And around, according to US intelligence, only about 30 to 40% of Hamas fighters have been killed. Now, because that says two things. One, that Hamas's use of insurgency tactics has been remarkably effective, despite the insane damage that's now occurred in Gaza. But also that Israel's AI tactics, which were essentially still having some human oversight, But essentially what the reporting said, and people I've spoken to said that there was maybe 20 seconds at best for a human to actually approve a military strike. Now, no one can seriously assess that in 20 seconds. It's like putting a rubber stamp on a decision. And the impact was that civilians were killed in massive numbers, particularly in the first 3 or 4 months, to the point now, of course, where we've got 35, 40, 45,000 Palestinians killed, the vast majority of whom are civilians. And what concerns me about this technology is that many other states will be looking at what Israel is doing in Gaza with admiration, not with disgust, with admiration. And already we've been seeing in the last months at a lot of global arms fairs, Israel trying to sell and promote these kinds of tools, not particularly the one that you just referenced, but other AI-enabled tools at arms fairs, robot dogs, certain AI drones that are being battle tested in Gaza as we speak. And I don't doubt that in the next 6, 12 months, if not more, you will see similar tools that we just talked about that are now being used in Gaza and other conflict zones, because so many other states look to Israel as the model in warfare. And just finally, it's worth saying that, yes, they're interested in the AI weaponry, but also something else. The idea of how does Israel get away with this?
Yeah.
Now, that's not something you necessarily buy for money, but it's something that says, despite all the outrage in parts of the world, Israel is still not stopping. The war is not over. The US, which is the main player in this, of course, has made a conscious decision not to stop this war, which they could. And that, I think, is something that many other states would like to have in their own conflicts.
And another area where Israel is very much advanced in terms of surveillance technologies is the production of spyware. So basically, computer virus that can be injected into smartphones on computers with the purpose of surveilling the owner of those devices. And of course, this can be used for law enforcement operations, legit or not, but it's constantly being used by oppressive regimes to monitor opposition, political opposition, or even journalists. And NSO is one of the biggest company from Israel producing this software. And in recent years, Pegasus, they're kind of the Lamborghini of the spyware, if we want, has been made in the news all around the world. So how that has been also developing, and do you see any connection between what we came to learn about Israel harassing and kind of putting pressure on the International Criminal Court, which we came to learn in the past few weeks?
I mean, hugely. There's no doubt that Israel has used various forms of spyware, almost certainly Pegasus. We don't know 100% that Pegasus was used, but I'm pretty confident that it was, or something similar, to go after or try to spy on the International Criminal Court, both the last lead prosecutor and the current one, Karim Khan. And I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book, and obviously there's been lots of media coverage in the last years about Pegasus, so I won't rehash all that here, but I think it's worth saying that one of the ways that Israel has tried to promote itself and to make friends globally is to use tools like Pegasus as a diplomatic carrot. In other words, Netanyahu, as prime minister, who's been there seemingly forever, has often gone around the world in the last 10 years to countries like India and Rwanda and Hungary and many others, and essentially said to them, we would like to be closer to you diplomatically, militarily. We will sell you this unbelievably powerful spyware that allows you to go after dissidents, human rights workers, activists, people we don't like, opposition parties. And in return, we would like you to maybe support us more at the UN on certain votes or buy more weapons. And that has played out on one hand very well for Israel. The countries I just mentioned, India, which is now the world's biggest democracy, although I would question that description, but massive country, is now unbelievably close to Israel. And that's not just because of spyware, it's for a range of reasons. Ideological alignment. I think two nations that see ethno-nationalism as the best way to organize life, either Hindu in India's case or Jewish in Israel's case. But spyware has been a key way that Israel has made huge amounts of friends globally, transactional friendships, really.
Yeah.
And even if Pegasus falls over tomorrow, which is the main lead spyware, there are so many other companies that are doing exactly the same thing now that have much less attention. It allows you to access your entire phone without anyone knowing about it. And it's an unbelievably dangerous tool without any regulation still. There's no global regulation on spyware, zero. And that's an outrage.
And we still have a few minutes, and we both are journalists. And I would like to ask you, how is this conflict being portrayed in the media? How is your perception of the actual description of a genocide happening, and how are the media behaving in general? I know it's difficult to generalize, but what's your feeling if you ask about that, especially in light of what we know of censorship on social media, on active shadow banning against the Palestinian discourse online? And I would just like to remind you to the audience, the latest figures provided by the Committee to Protect Journalists says that 108 journalists have been killed since the beginning of the conflict, which is horrendous, undescribable, and unprecedented. So I would like to ask you on the media role in all of this.
As you say, it's hard to generalize, but there's no doubt that for particularly young people in many countries, including parts of Europe, the US, and elsewhere, they increasingly do not access the mainstream media. They don't read the media. They don't read, as in the traditional, what I mean by that, the traditional media. They often get their information from social media, for better or worse. And there's no doubt that the fact that the US now wants to ban TikTok, which I'm not a big supporter of TikTok for a range of reasons, but the idea that the US government and countless politicians want to ban TikTok. Why? Often these politicians have openly said why, that they're concerned that so many young Americans since October 7 are supporting Palestine because of what they're seeing on TikTok. So therefore, let's ban TikTok. Not worried about what they're seeing, the fact that they're seeing dead babies every day and just horrific carnage in Gaza. And that, to me, in some ways, is the massive power of social media, which is very hard to control. Yes, as my book talks about in depth, there's huge amounts of censorship, shadow banning. I'm not denying any of that, and it's increased since October 7th. But I'm actually not convinced it's working. What I mean by that is unless every single pro-Palestine voice gets censored, which I guess theoretically is possible, the fact is that the poll numbers, particularly of young people 18 to 35, in many, many countries, show the reality that they are outraged, angry, pissed off, disillusioned with either their own governments, with the Israeli government, whether these are students protesting at university encampments in the US, parts of Europe, England, etc., demanding sanctions, whatever it may be. That has not come because of what they're reading in the New York Times or the Washington Post or even the Guardian. They're getting it off from social media. And the images don't lie. People are seeing this mass destruction all the time. So if you ask, my assessment, a lot of the media is that, yes, there's been some good reporting, good journalism is happening, including in the mainstream press. Yep. But in general, I still think there is a weird reluctance, not that weird maybe, a reluctance to actually call out the brutality for what it is. There's no hesitation calling out Russian brutality in Ukraine, the language that is used. There's still sort of nervousness around talking too much about what Israel's doing in Gaza. And I think that hypocrisy is seen by many, many citizens around the world, including in your country.
Antony, our time is unfortunately up, and I would like to use the final seconds to thank you for being with us today, and thank you. Thank you for your work in particular. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. I wish I could be there in person. Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.